Unaware, I was a billionaire. A story of betrayal, legacy, and the truth that changes everything. Featuring Charlotte Hodgson and Mason Baldwin. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He didn't even have the decency to look me in the eye when he said it. Mason Baldwin, the man I had given 27 years of my life to, simply placed a leather folder on our kitchen table in Portland, Oregon, folded his hands like a closing argument, and told me our marriage was over. She's 24, he said, younger than the furniture we picked out together. She has ambition. She wants something out of life. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the folder across the room. I sat very still and thought about how strange it was that a man could dismantle 27 years of love with the same calm he used to order coffee. What Mason didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that he wasn't walking away from a quiet art teacher with modest savings and a part-time community center schedule. He was walking away from the sole heir to a $2 billion private investment trust that my father had spent 40 years building in silence. He thought he was leaving behind an ordinary woman. He thought he was upgrading his life, trading in the steady and familiar for something younger, louder, and more thrilling. He thought he had already won. But there is a particular kind of justice in life that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or dramatic speeches. It simply waits, patient and precise, for exactly the right moment. And that moment was already coming. Mason Baldwin had just made the most expensive mistake of his entire life. He just didn't know it yet. And honestly, neither did I. Chapter 1. The morning it happened, Portland was doing what Portland does in October, draping everything in gray. A slow, steady rain tapped against the kitchen windows of the house Charlotte Hodgson had shared with her husband for nearly 3 decades. She was pouring her second cup of coffee when Mason walked in, set his briefcase beside the island, and pulled out a leather folder. That folder was the first sign. Mason Baldwin did not carry personal documents in his briefcase. He was a corporate attorney, meticulous, deliberate, never casual about paperwork. If he had brought a folder home, it wasn't by accident. "Charlotte," he said. His voice was steady, even, almost clinical. "We need to talk." She set down her mug. He sat across from her at the table, the same table where they had eaten thousands of meals, argued about trivial things, laughed about inside jokes she suspected no one else would ever understand. Now he looked at her the way he probably looked at opposing counsel. Neutral. Decided. "I'm leaving you," he said. The words landed without drama. No trembling lip. No guilt flickering behind his eyes. Just the quiet finality of a man who had already moved on emotionally long before this conversation. Charlotte didn't move. She searched his face for something human, hesitation, sorrow, even the faintest trace of second-guessing. She found nothing. "I don't understand," she said. Her own voice sounded distant to her, borrowed from some calmer version of herself. Mason leaned back. "Let's not make this harder than it has to be." Harder. She almost asked him what he meant, but something stopped her. Instead, she asked the question she already feared answering. "Is there someone else?" A pause. Brief. Deliberate. "Yes." The rain intensified against the glass. Charlotte pressed her palm flat against the table and felt the cool wood beneath her fingers. Real, solid, present. "She's younger," Mason continued. Almost unnecessarily, as if he wanted her to understand the full scope of what he was choosing. "How much younger?" Another pause. "She's 24. Charlotte did the arithmetic without meaning to. She was 54. The woman Mason was replacing her with was closer in age to their daughter Elise than to Charlotte herself. The thought was so absurd it almost made her laugh. "She runs a lifestyle brand," Mason added. "Travel content. Online presence. She wants something big out of life." Charlotte looked at her hands. They weren't trembling yet. She wondered if that was shock or strength. She couldn't tell the difference anymore. "And what does that mean about me?" she asked. "That I don't want something big?" Mason opened the folder. "This isn't about you lacking anything. Our life isn't going anywhere. Our life, She repeated quietly. 27 years isn't going anywhere. He slid the folder across the table. Inside were papers she recognized immediately. Divorce filings. Financial disclosures. A settlement proposal drafted with the kind of precision that could only come from someone who had been planning this for months. You already filed, she said. Mason nodded. My attorney recommends your response within 10 days. Charlotte read slowly. She had always trusted Mason to handle the financial architecture of their marriage, the investments, the property, the retirement structures. She had focused on teaching, on painting, on the community art program she ran twice a week. Now, as she scanned the settlement terms, a cold, precise understanding settled in her chest. He hadn't just planned to leave. He had planned to leave her with almost nothing. The house was in his name. The investment accounts were structured through his firm. The retirement funds held clauses she had never read carefully enough to understand. You've been preparing this for a while, she said. I didn't want things to get complicated. Complicated. 27 years of marriage reduced to a legal strategy. When did it start? Charlotte asked. Mason was quiet for a moment. About a year ago. A year. Which meant while they were together at his firm's Christmas party. While they were driving up to the coast for their anniversary. While Charlotte was sitting across this very table from him, unaware. He stood, picked up his briefcase, and moved toward the front door. Her name is Sienna, he said, almost as an afterthought. I'd appreciate it if you were discreet about this. Sienna, 24 years old. A lifestyle brand. And Charlotte's husband of 27 years had already chosen her over everything they had built together. The front door closed. The rain continued. And Charlotte sat alone at the kitchen table, looking at divorce papers that were designed to take everything, not knowing that somewhere across the city, a trust bearing her maiden name was about to change everything. Chapter 2. Charlotte did not sleep that night. She lay in the bed she had shared with Mason for over 2 decades and listened to the house breathe around her. The settling of walls, the hum of the heating system, the muffled sound of rain finally easing into silence somewhere around 4 a.m. At 5, she gave up entirely and walked into the living room. The family photos were still on the wall. Their 20th anniversary in Tuscany. Elise's college graduation. A candid shot from a hike in Colorado that Charlotte barely remembered taking. She stood in front of them for a long time, cataloging them the way you might catalog items in an estate sale, wondering which things had always held value and which had only seemed to. By 8 a.m, her phone had begun to ring. It was her closest friend, Diane Hartley, someone Charlotte had known since their first semester at university in Edinburgh, someone who had always delivered truth without ceremony. Are you sitting down? Diane asked immediately. I'm standing, Charlotte said. Should I be sitting? Probably. Diane hesitated. Have you been on Instagram this morning? Charlotte hadn't. She had never really used the platform. It had always felt like performing a life instead of living one. But Diane sent a link anyway. The profile loaded. Sienna Vale. 240,000 followers. A grid of curated perfection, rooftop restaurants, European hotels, designer boutiques in London and Milan, sun-drenched boat decks off the coast of Sardinia. And there, posted 3 hours ago, Mason Baldwin. Smiling. Champagne glass raised. His arm around a blonde woman in a white dress who looked as though she had never once experienced an unplanned Tuesday. The caption read, New chapter begins. Some choices change everything. Charlotte stared at the screen. The pain was there, but it was quieter than she expected, almost buried under something else. Clarity, perhaps. She scrolled further. A post from 6 weeks ago. Mason and Sienna outside a glass tower in downtown Portland. The caption, moving into something beautiful. Charlotte stopped scrolling. That building, she recognized it. One of the most expensive luxury developments in the entire city. Penthouse units started at $3 million. She called Diane back. Did you look into when he bought it? Diane exhaled slowly. Property records show 7 weeks ago. 7 weeks. while Charlotte was beside him at a fundraiser for the Portland Children's Hospital. While they were sharing Sunday dinners and pretending the marriage was simply quiet rather than dead. He wasn't just falling for someone else, Charlotte said softly. He was building a whole other life. Yes, Diane said. I'm so sorry. Charlotte looked out the window. The street outside was ordinary, a neighbor walking a dog, a delivery van idling at the curb. Everything normal except the interior of her world. Later that afternoon, a courier arrived. The envelope bore the name of a law firm Charlotte had never heard of. Inside were formal divorce filings, financial disclosures, and a settlement document. She read every page twice. The terms were precise and deliberately lean. A cash payment that might have seemed generous to someone who didn't know Mason's actual net worth. No claim to the investment portfolios. No claim to the property. No ongoing support beyond the settlement figure. He had structured it to look fair while being entirely designed in his favor. Charlotte set the documents down and thought about something her father used to say. Silence is its own kind of strategy, Charlie. Never rush to respond when patience will do more damage to the other side. She didn't know it then, but her father's wisdom was about to mean something far greater than she imagined. Chapter 3. 3 days after receiving the settlement documents, Charlotte received a phone call from a man named Oliver Crane. He identified himself as the senior partner at Crane & Associates, a private legal and financial advisory firm based in Seattle. He said he had been trying to reach her for 2 days, and that the matter was urgent. My firm represented your father, Edward Hodgson, for the last 20 years of his life, Oliver said carefully. There are documents and arrangements he made that require your immediate attention. Charlotte's father had passed away 2 years earlier. He had been a quiet, private man, a civil engineer by training who had spent most of his life in understated comfort. He didn't talk about money. He didn't celebrate it. He drove a modest car, lived in the same house in Edinburgh for 40 years, and kept his affairs so private that Charlotte had assumed there was very little to settle after he was gone. The estate had seemed straightforward. A house, a moderate investment account, some savings. She had handled everything through a local solicitor in Scotland and never questioned the simplicity of it. What kind of arrangements? Charlotte asked carefully. Oliver paused. I think this conversation is better had in person, Mrs. Baldwin. Would you be able to come to our Seattle office? She made the drive the following morning. The Crane & Associates office occupied 3 floors of a quietly distinguished building in the heart of the city, the kind of place that communicated competence without advertising it. Oliver Crane was in his early 60s, silver-haired, measured in his movements, the kind of man who chose every word deliberately. Beside him sat a woman named Patricia Webb, a financial advisor who managed the firm's most complex trust structures. We appreciate you coming, Oliver said as Charlotte settled into the chair across from them. Before we begin, I want to assure you that everything we're about to share is fully documented and legally verified. Charlotte folded her hands. Please just tell me what this is about. He slid a sealed envelope across the desk. Your father left this for you specifically. He asked that it be delivered only when certain conditions were met. What conditions? Oliver met her eyes steadily. The dissolution of your marriage. Charlotte didn't move for a moment. Then she picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was a letter, handwritten, 3 pages, in her father's precise architectural script. She read it slowly. Twice. Her father had written it 4 years before his death. He explained that throughout his life, he had invested quietly, built carefully, and trusted almost no one with the full picture of his financial life. He had structured an investment trust, the Hodgson Private Trust, through a holding company that had grown significantly over 4 decades. He wrote that he had watched too many marriages collapse when wealth was known too early. He had watched his own friends' children grow up defined by money rather than character. He had watched people love the idea of wealth rather than the person who created it. And so he had made a decision, strange as it might seem. The trust would transfer fully to Charlotte only when her marriage ended. Not because he wished her marriage to fail, but because he needed to know, when that day came, that whoever remained in her life afterward would be there for her and not for what she was worth. Charlotte set the letter down. Her hands were very still. Oliver spoke gently. "Your father was a remarkably careful man." Charlotte looked up. "How much is the trust worth?" Patricia Webb opened a document. "As of last quarter, the consolidated value is approximately $2.1 billion. The number sat in the air between them like a physical thing. Charlotte said nothing for a long time. She thought about her father driving his 10-year-old car through Edinburgh. She thought about him drinking tea from a chipped mug at the kitchen table and telling her that the most important things in life were invisible to people who were only looking for something to take. She thought about Mason. And very quietly, for the first time since he walked out of her house, she understood exactly what was about to happen. Quick pause. If you're loving these billionaire love stories, don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Always remember that this channel continues to thrive because of the love you show. Thank you. Now, let's find out what happened in the remaining minutes of the story. Chapter 4. Charlotte drove back to Portland in a silence that felt different from any she had known before. Not the hollow silence of grief, but something slower and more complex. The silence of a person trying to fit a new understanding over the shape of a life they thought they already knew. Her father, quiet, tea-drinking, practical Edward Hodgson, who had never owned a flashy car, never taken a luxury vacation, never spoken about money beyond what was absolutely necessary. $2 billion. Built over 40 years. Structured into a private trust so carefully that even Charlotte, his only child, had known almost nothing about it. Back at her Portland apartment, she had already moved out of the marital home into a rented flat near the Willamette River. She sat at the kitchen table and read her father's letter a third time. What struck her most wasn't the money. It was the architecture of the plan. Her father hadn't made this decision carelessly. He had thought about human nature, about how wealth changes people, about how the wrong person in the wrong circumstances could use financial knowledge as a weapon, and he had designed a system to protect against all of it. She called Oliver Crane the next morning with a list of questions. "The company is called Hodgson Capital Group," Oliver explained patiently. "Your father founded it 38 years ago as a private investment vehicle. It holds stakes across 5 industries: pharmaceutical research, renewable infrastructure, commercial real estate in 3 U.S. cities, and 2 European technology companies." Charlotte pressed her pen against her notepad. He never mentioned any of this. Oliver's voice was warm. He was proud of what he built, but he believed that talking about it would attract the wrong kind of attention. He used to say that the moment your wealth becomes a conversation topic is the moment you lose control of it. That was exactly something her father would say. "And the management structure?" Charlotte asked. "He assembled a professional executive team years ago," Oliver replied. "Day-to-day operations run without needing you present. Your role, should you choose to step into it, is strategic. You guide the direction. You make the decisions that shape the long-term course of the company." Charlotte absorbed this. She thought about the settlement Mason had slid across the table, the carefully negotiated terms designed to leave her with modest resources and no leverage. "He had no idea," she said. "No," Oliver confirmed. "And legally, he has no claim. The trust predates your marriage by over a decade. It was never a marital asset." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "What happens when the divorce finalizes?" Oliver answered without hesitation. "The trust transfers to you in full. All accounts, all holdings, full controlling authority over Hodgson Capital Group." She sat back in her chair and looked out the window at the river below. A jogger passed on the path. A young couple walked their dog. Life, ordinary and unbothered, continued on the other side of the glass. Inside, Charlotte Hodgson was trying to understand how the woman Mason had dismissed as unambitious had somehow been standing on the edge of all of this the entire time. She thought about his words. She actually wants something out of life. And she thought about her father, building something extraordinary in complete silence for decades, waiting patiently for the truth to be ready. Like father, like daughter. She wasn't going to make a single dramatic move. She wasn't going to warn Mason. She wasn't going to tell a soul. She was simply going to wait for the process to unfold. Chapter 5. The weeks that followed Mason's departure settled into a strange rhythm. The divorce proceedings moved forward with the methodical pace of legal machinery. Documents filed, responses submitted, hearings scheduled. Mason's attorney was aggressive and thorough, exactly the kind of counsel you hired when you wanted to make sure the other party walked away with the minimum. Charlotte hired her own attorney. His name was Raymond Solis, a divorce and estate lawyer in Portland with a quiet reputation for being extraordinarily effective without making noise. Oliver Crane had recommended him. When Charlotte met Raymond in his office and showed him the settlement proposal Mason's team had submitted, he studied it for approximately 3 minutes before placing it face down on his desk. "This is designed to look reasonable," Raymond said. "It isn't." "I gathered that," Charlotte replied. He looked at her carefully. "You mentioned a trust. A significant one." "Yes." Raymond leaned forward. "Tell me everything." She told him. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The trust predates the marriage?" "By 14 years. And it was structured entirely through your father's private holding company, with your maiden name as beneficiary?" "Correct." Raymond exhaled slowly. "Then his attorneys have nothing. Whatever Mason files, whatever argument he constructs, it won't touch the trust. It was never marital property. It will never be marital property." Charlotte nodded. "I just want to make sure the divorce finalizes cleanly." Raymond smiled slightly. "That I can guarantee." Outside Raymond's office, she walked along the riverside path for a while. The afternoon was cool and clear, the kind of autumn day Portland occasionally produced between the endless gray stretches. Gold leaves lifted off the oaks along the path and drifted slowly into the water. She thought about Elise. Her daughter had called the evening before, having heard about the divorce through the family grapevine. The call had been difficult. Elise was hurt and angry and not entirely sure where to direct those emotions. Charlotte had held the space for it, said very little, and promised to explain everything properly when the time was right. There was still so much she hadn't said. To Elise. To her friends. To anyone. She also thought about Mason's social media. Diane had, reluctantly, kept Charlotte updated. Sienna Vale had posted twice more in the past week. Once from a restaurant in San Francisco, she and Mason, champagne again, the hashtag accompanying the post something about authentic living. Once from what appeared to be a preview of interior design choices for the penthouse. Charlotte found, to her surprise, that the images didn't wound her the way she expected. They produced something closer to detached curiosity. She was watching a performance from a seat that was already clearing. Because the thing about patience, her father had always said, was that it only felt like waiting to the person who didn't understand what was already in motion. Charlotte understood now. The process was already in motion. The divorce would finalize. The trust would transfer. And the world, including Mason Baldwin, was going to find out exactly who Charlotte Hodgson had always been. She just needed a little more time. Chapter 6. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday morning in November. Charlotte arrived at the Multnomah County Courthouse at 8:45 in a charcoal wool coat and leather gloves, her hair pinned neatly back. Raymond Solis walked beside her. The building was modest, the kind of place where dozens of lives were legally rearranged every single day with the same bureaucratic efficiency. Mason was already in the corridor when she arrived. He wore a dark suit, impeccable, professional, the kind of appearance he assembled whenever he needed to feel in control. He was accompanied by his attorney, a tall woman named Claudia Peretti who had a reputation for being formidably aggressive in high-asset divorces. When Mason saw Charlotte, he nodded, a short, businesslike acknowledgement. She returned it. The hearing itself was brief. The judge reviewed the agreements, asked several procedural questions, and signed the final order within 20 minutes. 27 years of marriage, dissolved in less time than it took to drive across the city. Mason rose from his chair as soon as the gavel came down. He didn't look at Charlotte, not directly. There was a brief, involuntary flicker of eye contact as they both moved toward the door, and then it passed. His expression was composed, even satisfied. He had obtained exactly what he had designed this outcome to produce. Charlotte walked into the corridor behind him and watched him disappear around the corner. Raymond touched her arm lightly. "How are you?" She thought about the question honestly. Surprisingly calm. He handed her a folder. Certified copies of the final judgment. He paused. "You know what this means?" Charlotte nodded. Yes, she did. The condition in her father's trust had just been met. Raymond offered to drive, but Charlotte said she preferred to walk. The November air was sharp and clean, and she needed to feel it against her face. She walked 6 blocks to where her car was parked, then sat inside it without turning the ignition. She opened her phone and found a message from Oliver Crane already waiting. 3 words. "It has transferred." She stared at the screen. $2 billion. $2.1 billion, to be precise. The consolidated value that Patricia Webb had quoted weeks ago in the Seattle office. All of it, legally, now hers. No fanfare. No announcement. Just a brief message on a gray November morning outside a courthouse in Portland, Oregon. She thought about Mason walking out of the same courthouse 40 minutes from now, returning to the penthouse he had bought for a 24-year-old woman, completely satisfied that he had orchestrated the most strategic exit of his life. She thought about his settlement offer, the modest cash figure, the stripped-down terms, the quiet confidence that she would simply sign and disappear. She thought about how wrong he was. Charlotte started the car. She drove back to her apartment with the radio off. Inside, she set the folder of court documents on the table, made herself a cup of tea, and sat beside the window watching the river. Then she called Oliver Crane. She had a company to understand, a legacy to honor, and a life to rebuild. Everything else could wait. Chapter 7. The news broke 3 days later. Charlotte was sitting at her apartment counter in the early morning, coffee in hand, reading through a report Patricia Webb had sent about the company's international portfolio, when her phone began buzzing with an intensity she had never experienced before. 10 messages in under a minute. Then 20. Then her phone rang. It was Diane. "Charlotte, turn on the financial news." "Right now?" Charlotte opened the first notification instead. It was from a financial wire service she occasionally monitored. The headline stopped her cold. Hodgson Capital Group confirms transfer. Billionaire heir Charlotte Hodgson takes controlling interest in $2.1 billion investment firm. Below the headline was a photograph, her, from a charity event 2 years ago. She was wearing a green dress she barely remembered and smiling at someone off camera. The image had been sourced from a local newspaper archive. The article was detailed and thoroughly researched. It outlined the company's investment history, the trust structure, her father's legacy as a private investor, and the unusual conditions under which the transfer had occurred, including, with apparent glee, the timing of her recent divorce. Diane's voice came back on the line. "You're everywhere. Financial sites, business blogs, even lifestyle outlets are picking it up." Charlotte set down her coffee. "So it's public." "Oh, it's very public." Diane paused. "Charlotte, the legal community in Portland is talking about it. His law firm shared the article internally this morning." Charlotte sat very still. "His law firm?" she repeated. There was a gentle, almost reluctant note of satisfaction in Diane's voice. "I imagine walking into his office this morning was an interesting experience for him." Charlotte could picture it exactly. Mason arriving at his firm on a Wednesday, settling into the routine confidence of a man who believed he had already won, and then watching the headline travel through his firm's email chain like wildfire. The woman he had left for being unambitious. The woman he had handed a stripped-down settlement designed to ensure she walked away quietly. The woman he had replaced with a 24-year-old with a lifestyle brand. That woman was now the headline. Her phone rang again. An unknown number. She answered. Charlotte. Mason's voice came through like a man who had just been hit by something he didn't see coming. His calm was completely gone. What is this? Good morning, she said. I'm looking at an article that says you control a $2 billion investment company. His voice was strained. Tell me this isn't real. It's real, she said. A silence followed that lasted nearly 10 seconds. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. Tell you what? That this existed. Mason exhaled sharply. Charlotte. My father structured the trust before we were married. I had no knowledge of its full value until after you filed. Another pause. You're telling me you found out after I left? Yes. The silence that followed was the most profound she had ever heard from a man who had never struggled to fill quiet space with confident words. You walked away from this, she said calmly. That was your choice. He didn't answer. And in that silence, she could hear the full weight of his miscalculations settling over him like weather. Chapter 8. Mason called again the next morning. Charlotte was standing on her apartment balcony with her second cup of tea when the phone rang. She let it ring twice before answering. I need to talk to you, he said. His voice was different again from the day before, less shocked, more calculated. The attorney was reasserting himself. You're talking to me now, she replied. Face to face. I think we should meet. Charlotte watched a boat move slowly along the river below. What for? I made a mistake. She had expected him to say many things in the wake of the headlines. She had not expected sincerity to come this quickly. The admission surprised her, not because she doubted it was true, but because Mason Baldwin had never been a man who admitted mistakes without an agenda. What kind of mistake? She asked. He exhaled. I left too quickly. I didn't. I misjudged things. You misjudged things, she repeated calmly. Yes. And I've been thinking about us. About the marriage. About whether we moved too fast through this. Charlotte almost laughed. We didn't move too fast. You spent a year planning this. You purchased a penthouse 7 weeks before you told me. He was quiet. Mason, she said, the divorce is final. There is nothing to reconsider. I spoke to my attorney this morning. He paused. He believes there may be grounds to revisit the asset disclosure in light of the trust, Charlotte finished. Yes. Raymond had already predicted this conversation with near-perfect accuracy. He had handed Charlotte a summary of the likely legal arguments Mason's team might raise and explained, in clean professional language, exactly why none of them would succeed. The trust predated the marriage. It was never a marital asset. Full stop. You should speak to your attorney again, she said. More carefully this time. Charlotte, he shifted tone. I'm not just talking about the legal angle. I'm talking about us. There is no us anymore. Mason, I know things are. The situation looks bad. But I think what I felt for you, what we had. She stopped him. 2 weeks ago you told me our life wasn't going anywhere. You told me Sienna had ambition. You had a folder of divorce papers you had spent months preparing. That version of you was honest. This version is just afraid of what you lost. Silence. What about Sienna? Charlotte asked. She moved out, he said finally. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. When? The night the article ran. He sounded hollowed out by the admission. She saw the headlines. She asked me if I knew about the trust. When I said no, she didn't believe me at first. I had to show her the divorce timeline. Charlotte felt something that was not quite sympathy, but was adjacent to it. The young woman who had posted champagne photos and celebrated her new chapter had apparently decided that the chapter looked less appealing when the billionaire in the story wasn't the man she'd chosen. I'm sorry that happened, Charlotte said, and she meant it, in the way you can be sorry for someone's pain without wishing things had gone differently. Mason exhaled. I deserve this, don't I? It wasn't a question. Charlotte chose her words carefully. I think you're learning something important. What's that? That the value of something isn't always visible to the people who aren't paying attention. Another long silence. Then he asked, very quietly, is there any way back? No, she said. There isn't. But there's a way forward. For both of us. She ended the call and looked out at the river for a long time. Chapter 9. For days after the headlines broke, Charlotte received a text message from an unknown number. Hi Charlotte. I know this is probably the last message you expected. This is Sienna Vale. I was hoping we could talk. There are some things you should probably know about Mason. Charlotte read it twice. Then she put her phone face down on the counter and made herself a proper lunch before responding. She had expected many things to come out of this divorce. A conversation with the woman who had replaced her was perhaps the most surreal possibility on the list. Eventually, curiosity won. What kind of things? She typed back. Sienna's reply came immediately. Can we meet somewhere? A coffee shop? I'm not trying to cause drama. I just think you deserve to know. Charlotte agreed to meet the following afternoon at a small cafe near the waterfront. She arrived early, ordered tea, and was already seated when Sienna walked in. In person, Sienna Vale looked younger than her photograph suggested, 24, perhaps, but with the self-consciousness of someone who had recently had a very difficult week. She wore a simple beige sweater and jeans, no visible makeup, no designer accessories. The curated confidence of her social media was entirely absent. She sat down quickly. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't, Charlotte said honestly. Sienna folded her hands around her coffee cup. I need you to know I didn't know about the trust. I had no idea. Charlotte studied her. I believe you. That seemed to relieve Sienna more than she expected. She exhaled. Mason told me you had a small inheritance from your father. That was the only mention of money I ever heard from him. That's what I believed too, Charlotte said. Until I didn't. Sienna nodded slowly. I broke up with him the night the article ran. I know that probably looks terrible. It looks honest, Charlotte said. Which is something. Sienna glanced at the table. That's not the main reason I wanted to talk to you. She hesitated. Mason has been telling people something. I think you should be prepared for it. Charlotte set down her cup. Tell me. He's been saying you knew about the trust before the divorce. That you concealed it. He's using the word deception with his attorney. Charlotte absorbed this without flinching. He knows that isn't true. Yes, but it's easier for him to believe than the alternative, which is that he made the mistake himself, Charlotte said quietly. Sienna nodded. She reached into her bag and slid her phone across the table. I've been receiving his messages since I moved out. He's planning to file something. A motion challenging the asset disclosure. Charlotte read the message thread quickly. It confirmed what Raymond had already predicted. Mason was planning to argue that the trust constituted a hidden marital asset. She slid the phone back across the table. Thank you for telling me. Sienna looked at her carefully. You're not angry. About which part? Any of it. Charlotte thought about this genuinely. Not anymore, she said. I think I was angry for about 3 days. But then the letter arrived from my father, and something shifted. Sienna was quiet for a moment. What did he say? In the letter? He said the right person would value me long before they ever knew what I was worth. Sienna was still for a long moment. Then, softly, I think I understand why he protected you the way he did. Charlotte looked at the young woman across the table. She seemed genuinely changed by the events of the past week, less the glossy, confident presence of her public profile, and more simply a person who had learned something hard about the kind of men who choose women as accessories to a life they're building for themselves. You'll be okay, Charlotte said. Sienna smiled faintly. So will you. I think you already are. Chapter 10. The following Monday, Charlotte walked into the Hodgson Capital Group offices for the first time as its controlling shareholder. The building was in Seattle, a clean, 7-story glass structure near the waterfront that communicated substance without showmanship. No giant logo above the entrance. No dramatic atrium. Just a polished lobby, efficient staff, and the kind of quiet energy that accumulates in a place where serious work gets done every day. Oliver Crane met her at the entrance and walked her through the building personally. She passed rows of analysts studying screens, a portfolio review in progress through a glass wall, a small library of financial research reports that her father had apparently collected over 40 years. He loved physical documents, Oliver said, gesturing toward the library. He always said that a screen makes information feel temporary. Charlotte trailed her fingers along the spines of the binders. They were labeled by year, by industry, by region. Her father's handwriting appeared on the tabs of the oldest ones, small, precise, architectural. She recognized it immediately. He built this himself, she said. From nothing. From a single infrastructure contract in 1986, Oliver confirmed. He took the consulting fee, invested it, and never stopped. In the executive conference room, the company's senior leadership team was assembled. 6 people, each responsible for a different pillar of the portfolio. Charlotte had read their biographies the night before. Every person in the room had decades of experience and had chosen to work for Hodgson Capital Group specifically because of the way the company was run. My father clearly built something that people wanted to be part of, Charlotte said as she took her seat. He was very selective about who he hired, Oliver confirmed. He used to say that a company's character is determined by the people it chooses to keep. The meeting ran for 2 hours. Each division head presented their current strategies: pharmaceutical research partnerships in Boston, a renewable energy infrastructure project in Texas, commercial real estate holdings in Portland and London, 2 European technology companies in the early stages of significant growth. Charlotte listened and asked questions. She didn't try to demonstrate knowledge she didn't have. She simply tried to understand, honestly, directly, without performance. The division head for healthcare investment, a woman named Dr. Rachel Frost, paused midway through her presentation and looked at Charlotte with something like recognition. "You remind me of your father," she said. He listened the same way. Charlotte wasn't sure what to do with that, so she simply said, "Tell me more about the neurological research partnership. I want to understand what the funding actually makes possible." Dr. Frost smiled and continued. After the meeting, Oliver walked Charlotte to his office on the top floor. Through the window, the Seattle waterfront stretched out in the November light. "You handled that very well," Oliver said. Charlotte sat down. "I mostly asked questions." He handed her a cup of tea. "That's exactly what good leadership does." She looked out at the water. "My father sat in this room, didn't he?" "Hundreds of times," Oliver said. "That was his chair." Charlotte sat in it for a moment without saying anything. Then she looked up. "I want to understand this company the way he understood it. Not just the numbers. The intention behind it." Oliver nodded. "Then let me tell you where he started." And he did. For the next hour, he told her the story of Edward Hodgson, the engineer who had quietly become one of the most disciplined private investors in the Pacific Northwest, who had never sought recognition and never lost sight of why he was building what he was building. By the time Charlotte left the building, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel for a long time. Ready. Chapter 11. Mason's legal move came 11 days after the headlines broke. Raymond Solis called Charlotte on a Thursday afternoon with the kind of measured calm that told her the news was expected rather than alarming. "He filed," Raymond said, "a motion challenging the asset disclosure in the divorce proceedings. His team is arguing that the trust, given its size, constituted a marital asset that was withheld from proper financial disclosure." Charlotte sat down. "What are our options?" "We respond," Raymond said simply, "with the trust documentation, the founding date, the beneficiary structure, and the legal history of the instrument." "His argument has no foundation, Charlotte. The law is very clear on this. How long will it take to resolve?" "If the judge is efficient, and I expect she will be, a preliminary hearing in 3 weeks. We'll get a ruling on the motion shortly after." Charlotte nodded. "What does this cost him?" Raymond paused. "Beyond the legal fees?" He said carefully. "His reputation. The legal community in Portland and Seattle, where Hodgson Capital Group's profile was growing, was a relatively contained world. People noticed when a corporate attorney filed a challenge against a trust that had been legally structured for over 4 decades in an attempt to claim financial interest in a company he had never known existed. People had opinions about that. Diane called that evening with an update Charlotte hadn't requested, but found illuminating. Apparently 3 of Mason's key clients had put their engagements under review, Diane said carefully. 2 of them have investment relationships with firms that are portfolio partners of Hodgson Capital Group. Charlotte absorbed this. That isn't something I orchestrated. I know, Diane said. That's the thing about consequences. They don't need to be arranged. Charlotte thought about that for a while after she hung up. She thought about the way Mason had moved through their marriage, confident that his success gave him a kind of immunity, that his career, his reputation, his social position were all structures he had built so carefully that they couldn't be touched. And then he had made a choice. A deliberate, long-planned choice to leave the woman who turned out to be the heir to the most significant private investment trust in the Pacific Northwest, based entirely on the assumption that she had nothing. The consequences of that choice weren't orchestrated. They were simply physics. The preliminary hearing took place 3 weeks later. Charlotte sat in a courtroom row behind Raymond while Mason's attorney, the formidable Claudia Peretti, presented the motion. Charlotte watched Peretti work and thought she was extraordinarily good at her job. But the trust documents were ironclad. The founding date, the beneficiary designation, the 14 years of legal history that predated the marriage. Raymond presented everything with the quiet efficiency of someone who had known from the beginning that this motion was never going to succeed. The judge called a brief recess. When she returned, she dismissed the motion in under 10 minutes. Mason sat 3 rows ahead of Charlotte. She watched the line of his shoulders when the ruling came. The almost imperceptible drop, the brief stillness of a man processing a loss he had told himself wasn't possible. She didn't feel satisfaction. She felt something closer to relief that the chapter was finally, completely over. In the corridor afterward, Mason turned and found her standing a few feet away. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he said, very quietly, "I'm done trying." "I know," she said. He nodded once, turned, and walked away. Chapter 12. She ran into Mason on a Saturday morning in December. Charlotte had stopped at a small market near the waterfront to pick up a few things for the weekend: sourdough bread, a bottle of wine for a dinner Diane had invited her to, fresh herbs for the risotto she'd been planning all week. She was reaching for a bunch of thyme near the back of the produce section when she heard her name. "Charlotte." She turned. Mason Baldwin was standing at the far end of the aisle. He was wearing jeans and a dark green jacket. No suit, no briefcase, none of the careful professional armor she had watched him assemble every morning for 27 years. His hair was slightly longer than she remembered, and there were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been doing a lot of thinking. "Hello, Mason," she said. He walked toward her slowly, hands in his pockets. "I wasn't sure you'd still come to this part of the city." "It's a grocery store," she replied. "I come here for vegetables." He gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. "Right." They stood in the produce aisle for a moment in the kind of silence that wasn't hostile, but wasn't comfortable either. The silence of 2 people who once knew each other's dailiness completely, and now moved through the world as strangers with shared history. "I read about the Bennett Foundation," he said finally. The foundation had been announced a week earlier. The Hodgson Creative Education Foundation, named after her father, dedicated to funding art and music programs in community centers across the Pacific Northwest. The name Hodgson had been Charlotte's quiet tribute. "It's something I care about," she said simply. "It shows." He paused. "It sounds like something your father would have loved." "Yes." She held the bunch of thyme in her hand. "It does." Mason looked at her carefully. "You seem," he searched for the word, "settled." "I am." She meant it. Another silence. Then he said something she didn't expect. "I owe you an apology that isn't wrapped in a legal strategy." Charlotte looked at him. "Not for the trust," he continued. "I mean for what I said. About ambition. About our life not going anywhere. About Sienna having something you apparently didn't." He ran a hand across the back of his neck. "It was condescending, and it was wrong, and it was based on something I completely misunderstood about what ambition actually looks like." Charlotte considered this. The apology was genuine. She could hear the difference between this and his earlier attempts, which had been motivated entirely by self-interest and financial calculation. This one came without an angle. "I appreciate that," she said. "I know it doesn't change anything." "No, but it's still worth saying." He nodded slowly. "What you're doing, the company, the foundation, all of it. I think it's exceptional." He paused. "I think your father knew exactly who he was protecting." Charlotte thought about the letter. The careful, deliberate handwriting. The 3 pages her father had taken such care to get right. "I think he did too," she said. Mason picked up a shopping basket from the stack beside the display. "I should let you get on with your day." She nodded. "Take care of yourself, Mason." He met her eyes for a brief moment. "You too, Charlotte." He turned and walked toward the checkout. She watched him go. Not with grief. Not with anger. Not with the hollow, echoing absence she had felt in those first weeks after the divorce. Just with the clear, quiet recognition that this was the proper end. 2 people parting from a life that had run its natural course, and each walking forward into something new. She placed the time in her basket and continued shopping. Chapter 13. 6 months after the divorce, Charlotte Hodgson's life bore almost no resemblance to the one she had lived before. Not because of the money, though $2 billion does tend to alter certain practical arrangements. The real difference was something that couldn't be deposited into an account or measured in a portfolio report. It was the feeling of moving through the world entirely on her own terms. No silent compromises, no gravitating towards someone else's definition of success, no more wondering whether she was too ordinary for the life she was living. She was still recognizably herself. She still taught art twice a week, at a community center in Portland's East Side, where she had quietly redirected enough foundation funding to build a new dedicated classroom and hire 2 additional tutors. She still started most mornings with tea before anything else. She still preferred rivers to oceans and quiet evenings at home to anything with a red carpet and a photographer. But she moved differently, more fully, with the particular confidence of someone who had stood on the edge of loss and discovered that what waited on the other side wasn't emptiness. It was everything she had been before the marriage reshaped her into something smaller. Hodgson Capital Group had continued to run smoothly under the executive team her father had assembled. Charlotte had gradually increased her involvement, attending strategy sessions, meeting with division heads, asking the kind of questions that her father's letter had hinted she would eventually ask. She was not a corporate executive by nature, and she had no intention of pretending to be one. But she was, increasingly, a compelling custodian of something her father had spent his life building. The Hodgson Creative Education Foundation had grown faster than anyone expected. Within 6 months, it had funded art and music programs in 43 community centers across Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. 3 programs had been launched in partnership with schools in the Scottish Highlands, a quiet tribute to her father's origins that had produced, somewhat unexpectedly, coverage in 2 Edinburgh newspapers. Oliver Crane called one afternoon in April. He had just returned from a board presentation and sounded pleased. "Your father would have liked today very much," he said. "Tell me." The renewable infrastructure project in Texas just delivered its first power generation milestone. It's going to produce clean energy for about 60,000 homes by the end of the year. Oliver paused. He lobbied for that investment for 3 years before anyone else on the board believed in it. Charlotte stood at her window and looked out at the river. "He was always patient," she said. "He was never impatient," Oliver corrected gently. "There's a difference." That evening, Charlotte sat on her apartment balcony as the sun set over Portland. The sky had gone amber, and then deep rose, and then the particular shade of blue that comes just before dark, when the city's lights begin to assert themselves. She took out her father's letter. She had read it perhaps 20 times by now, but she returned to the final paragraph. "One day, the right person will come into your life, and that person will value you long before they ever know what you are worth." Build the life that attracts them, Charlie, not the life that impresses the wrong ones. She had once read those words as being about romantic love, about the kind of partner who might arrive after Mason. Now she understood them differently. The most important person her father had been writing about was her. Build the life that attracts them. Build the life that calls in the right things, the right relationships, the right purpose, the right sense of who you are when no one is defining you. She had spent 27 years being defined by someone else's idea of what a life should look like. She had called that love. She had called it stability. She had confused quietness for contentment and proximity for connection. Now she understood the difference. Her phone buzzed. A message from Elise. A photo of the new classroom mural at the Portland Community Center, completed that afternoon by the students. 50 feet of color and imagination painted by children aged 7 to 14. One of the kids had painted an enormous owl in the corner, wings spread, surrounded by stars and books and musical notes. Mom, Elise had written beneath the photo, they named the owl after you. They call her Charlotte the Great. Charlotte laughed for a long time. Then she wiped her eyes and looked back out at the city. $2 billion would, over time, do many things. It would fund research that might save lives. It would build infrastructure that might power homes. It would create spaces where children discovered things about themselves they might not have found otherwise. But the thing her father had actually given her, the real inheritance, the one that predated every legal document and financial structure, was the unwavering belief that she was worth protecting. Not because of what she owned, not because of what she controlled, but because of who she had always been. And the man who had walked out of her kitchen on a rainy October morning, certain that he was leaving something ordinary behind, would spend the rest of his life understanding exactly what he had failed to see. Charlotte Hodgson folded her father's letter, set it on the railing beside her tea, and watched the city lights come on one by one as the last of the daylight faded. She was not waiting for anything. She had already arrived. Hello, lovers and billionaires. We have come to the end of today's story. If you enjoyed it, take a few seconds to like the video and drop a comment, and if you're not a part of the family yet, please subscribe and turn on notifications. This is our own little corner of the internet, so be sure to visit every day because I upload exciting, emotional, and unforgettable stories every single day, and you don't want to miss what's coming next.